Yeah, so as we approach the 9 o'clock hour, I just want to welcome everybody and say good morning. My name is Michelle McQueen, and I'm the moderator for this session. And this is Welcome to Mythbusters, Dispelling Common Misconceptions of Tier 2 and 3. And you'll currently see the sketch code on the screen. So please record this now, as it's only available as we get started with this session. If you're applying for continuing education hours, you'll need to be present at the start of the session and stay for the full length of the session. And you'll note that the ending sketch code will be on the last slide. So be sure to record this code. Because of state guidelines, we will not be able to put it in the chat or put it up during the session. So thank you very much. And it's with my great pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Steve Goodman, the director of Michigan's Multi-Tiered System of Supports, or MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Here is the last chance for the code. So as people are on, please capture the code here if you're going for the sketches here. So I'm going to back up here a minute. First of all, because I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well, so that you have that information if you would like to contact me. This session is the Mythbusters, Dispelling Common Misconceptions of Tier 2, Tier 3, just to make sure you're in the right place. And my name is not Stephanie Dyer. So Stephanie had something come up and she's unable to present today. So I'll do my very best to try to channel her excellence. If you do ever get a chance to go into a training session or hear a presentation from Stephanie, she's just amazing. So it's a great opportunity. So welcome, and I'm going to continue on. Again, we're a smaller group. I see that there's 37 folks on. So please feel free to use the chat to communicate, and we'll do our best to try to answer questions or address comments that you might have. So just acknowledgments. Stephanie put all this work together. What you'll see, and she did this work with building upon Don Kincaid's some Florida work, the National Center of Intensive Intervention, the PBIS Center. What you'll see is you can download her presentation materials with that button, but because I'm filling in for her and I don't know all the things that she has in there because it's her experience, so I modified some things. So if you look at the upper right corner, there is a little box that says addition. Those slides are different from what you would download. So I just put that up there just to let you be aware that there's some differences. And I certainly can email the changes to you if you want, and that's where my email address is in the chat. So for this outcome, so for the next 75 minutes, hoping to talk about common myths and misconceptions that may inhibit effective implementation of a Tier 2 approach and also the more intensive Tier 3 interventions in schools, and to talk about facts and strategies to dispel these misconceptions. So because of this, we are moving forward with, as a multi-tiered approach. What we're finding is that there are just a lot of misconceptions. And even if we talk about tiers, like what is magic about Tier 2, Tier 3? Why can't we have 5 tiers or 20 tiers? So part of it is just the practical, right? We need to focus on fewer things and do it right. And in a sense, people argue, well, isn't there a 2-tier system with general ed, special ed? And that's part of the issue we're going to be talking about, difference between just special ed and how that looks at tiers. So looking at the who's here today and at what primary level do you work? So I'm going to put up a poll question here. And if you could help complete the poll, so you should see it come up, and I'm looking in real time, and it is still moving here forward. So we've got 33% administrators, 20% teachers, itinerant staff, social workers, psychologists, 15%, and then 29% other. So that's helpful to kind of look at who's attending today. Okay, so that's great information. So thank you for that. And then I'm going to look here. At what level do you primarily work here? So if you can fill out this next poll, and of course the levels are the school, the district, the ISD, or the state. And it looks like 64% are at school, and about a quarter are at the district and ISD level. So about 24%. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful to see who's here and at what level. Certainly, why that is important, because if you are at the state or ISD, you may be helping to address the misconceptions as people are implementing it. So it's the supporting of those who are implementing a multi-tiered approach. Okay, so if we look here, it's interesting, the whole history of the tiers. So some people collect precious moment things and other items. I collect triangles. And so over the years, it's interesting how people have approached this idea of a tiered approach. Back in the late 80s, 90s, Hill Walker and colleagues started to apply a multi-tiered approach that was the public health model and apply it to schools and working with students who experience behavior difficulties. And since that time, what we have found is that has been a really good rubric for the allocation of resources. It's an efficient way to allocate scarce resources in systems that just don't have, everything to do individualized treatment or programs for every student. But it's also, more importantly, a way to differentiate the support for students based on their need. And so what you can see here, just as a basic primer, that if we look at all the students in the school, all of them should be exposed to a tier 1 or universal approach. And for students who are struggling or need something in addition, they could get a targeted or supplemental approach, which would be a tier 2. And then certainly for the most intensive work for tier 3, most intensive needs. And you can see it broken down here for 80% for 80% of students who are receiving the universal, which would be everybody, right? 80% should do well with just the universal alone. And then we have 7 to 15 who may need something more. And then, certainly around 5-7% who need more intensive. When you look at this, one other thing to consider through a tiered approach is if we do not look at the tiers. So for example, if we say, let's only address the most important needs as they come up. So what we have found is in some of our areas, the students who have higher needs, the most intensive needs, sometimes those students are transient in their education, and it may be I'm going to try out this school and it's not working for me, so I will go to a school where my cousin's at, and stay there for a while and see if that works. And if that doesn't work, maybe I'll do a school of choice that's working, or a charter. So from that, if we don't address a prevention model, then as the students leave who have more intensive needs, there will be multiple others who could fill in that place of needing more intensive support, because there's no prevention that stops the flow of the just preventing more intensive supports. So that's just a consideration for around the tiers. So let's talk about some misconceptions, and some of this work. Just to be clear, there's the National Center for Intensive Intervention and the National Center for Positive Behavior Intervention Supports created combined work on a couple documents to really dispel the myths around tiers of support, and primarily the information that you can see in the downloads. From the presentation materials, the two resources are available there, and the target of that work or the focus is really on behavior support, but the theory and ideas can certainly be applied to the academic as well. So the first one here, misconception one: tier 2 is a bigger scoop of tier 1, or tier 2 is tier 3 light. So what this is getting at is the whole idea that it's really a different function that tier 2 provides. So it's not like we will just do a lesser version of tier 3. They really serve different purposes. And so what a tier 2 does, certainly as you can see here, tier 2 targeted consists of interventions that provide to a small group of targeted groups of students with similar needs. It's a really efficient way to address the needs of a group of students, because it's not individualized, right? We can put groups of students together with the same or similar needs, and it's a way to, in a short term, help to get students back on track. That's very different from tier 1, and that's very different from tier 3. When we talk about the tier 2 of getting students back on track to meet the guidelines or benchmarks or the standards, within that tier 2, it's not meant to go on forever. It's meant to say, we're going to try this 10 weeks or whatever, and try these programs. And after that, we should, hopefully the students would benefit from enough from tier 1. It's within that too, it's really strategically targeting skills of to develop, to encourage, to enhance, so that those students can benefit from that core program. Now, how that's different from tier 3, certainly, as you may be well aware, tier 3 is much more intensive. It's individualized. It's really looking with assessments and to see develop an individualized plan for student. And again, if there's questions or comments that you may have moving forward, please feel free to put in the chat. So what we do, if you look here, this is just a cleaner definition. So tier 2 involves supplemental, meaning that it's added on to tier 1. It's meant to be additive to help support. It's evidence-based interventions that are provided with increased level intensity. And when we say increased level, it's really focusing on what the need for the student is, instead of just throwing everything at the student for intervention. It's saying what is it that we primarily want to address, based on that need, in addition to the core instruction. So it's added onto the core, and it's provided to groups of students. And that intervention could be, I have 5 students all together and provide that intervention, or I could have that similar students would receive, but they could be receiving that intervention independently. So small group intervention for students could be social skills training. I've got 5 students together in a small group, And we're going to work on social skills training together to develop further skill development. A small group intervention for in a different way that doesn't have all students together would be something called check-in, check-out. And that's where students would be having a daily progress report. And on that chart, they would record after each session or learning period or time period. Are they meeting the goals for that? For example, for behavior, during reading, were you being respectful, responsible? And students would be taught what that means. And then during the math time, have you been respectful, responsible? So that is given to a small group of students, but the students aren't meeting together on it. So it can meet in together, or the small group could be independently working on those that same intervention. But it's all getting back to some risk of not meeting grade level or academic behavior standards. So that's kind of a more definition. I want to talk a little bit about some examples, non-examples. So as we look at tier 2, it's evidence-based interventions implemented with small groups of students with similar needs. So I gave you that social skills training or a check-in, check-out process. The additional instruction is provided with more frequent feedback. So if you're familiar with a check-in, check-out process, the student is prompted that they will have be evaluated or looking at monitoring and their behavior. That is prompted along the way. It is also giving more feedback, specific feedback after each period or class period. And that information is also reviewed at the end of the day. So there's multiple opportunities for prompting and for more frequent and specific that process. So it's just an example of that. We also want to look at more frequent data collection, because for tier 2, the idea is a student is experiencing some difficulty that we want to get back on track. So we need to look at the data and move forward as much as possible to make sure that they are going in the right direction so that we can get them through the tier 2 system. Tanya, I'm just looking at your process here. It says check in, check out. Is that considered a tier 2? Yes. So check in, check out would be considered a tier 2 approach for some students. But it's also, when we start talking about tier 3, it could layer on. So a more comprehensive approach might also include check in, check out as part of tier 3, but it also would be, could be social skills training connected with that, could be, but just the check in, check out would be considered a tier 2 approach. So thanks for your question. So a reading intervention for the 5 first grade students with similar error patterns, universal, that just would be an example if you are putting students in for a reading group, for example, on similar needs. So non-examples would be individualized intensive instruction. So that would be the tier 3 approach. It's more individualized. It's much more intensive. There's much more training programming involved with that. The interventions providing in core. If its intervention is provided in core, so what they're saying for this one, it's a non-example because it's either you go to the universal tier 1 or you go to tier 2 supports. And we're saying no, that you shouldn't be, it should be layering on instead of one or the other. Fewer practice opportunities, less instruction, but higher expectations. Saying that students should be doing better, but not giving the opportunity to do better through more learning trials does not mean it's a tier 2, so it's a non-example. Certainly classroom accommodations, that would not be considered tier 2 because those are things that are accommodations within tier 1 approach. So just differentiation as opposed to the extra support that's targeted based on developing skill set. And the final one here, social skills training by a counselor for a whole class. Why that would be a non-example, even though it's social skills training, it's not set up to be generalized across for the different instructors or different settings. So when you think about that idea, a tier 2 should be able to help support so that people can benefit, students can benefit from your universal program. If a counselor is coming in and doing a whole training, one thing is when the counselor leaves, does the teacher continue that work so it doesn't generalize as well? Second thing is the whole class is not considered a tier 2. Tier 2 is meant for smaller groups of individuals. The next thing I'd like you to consider, some people say, well, if we're doing tier 2, it's just providing extra time. So we allocate, for example, in the academic component, we're going to do 30 more minutes for targeted support. And what we are saying is, if you think about the rusty pipe analogy, time is not a sufficient factor in this. So take the analogy of the pipes. I've got brand new pipes. I put them out in the field and they start to rust. And we say, why do they rust? And it's because they were sitting out there for a long time. The time didn't make it rust, right? What happened is the oxidation of the moisture in the air going together and interacting with the metal. And so why I bring that up is when we talk about a tier 2 approach, it's not time allocated for it. It is what you do with that time. And so, for example, just saying we have 30 minutes of extra support for students. I want to know, what are you doing during those 30 minutes? Are you doing social skills instruction for students who may need help when they are presented when people are responding negatively to them or dealing with harassment? Or is it a skill development of reading areas or something like that? So it's specifically what you're doing. It's not just providing the time. So if you look here, poll 3, bring that up here. And for poll 3, if you could take a minute, and currently within your school district, how well would you or a colleague be able to clearly describe tier 2? Okay, so I'm just looking at it. It looks like 2/3 are saying so. And then pretty well, although we may have different descriptions across staff. I think that's a tricky thing that's really important. One is if you don't have clarity on what tier 2 approach, it may be difficult, one, for your leadership team or your administration or colleagues to support what it is, because you may have different ideas. So how do we get together on what it is? It's difficult to explain to parents, right, what it is. So sometimes it's helpful just to be very specific around what the intervention is, and then start looking at within your schools, what are those interventions that are provided for students who need extra help in addition to the core program. Okay, so thank you for that. The next misconception here is students move sequentially through tiers 1 and tier 2 before receiving intensive support. So what was interesting, so I've been in education for a while, going on about 40 years now, and early in my career, so I was a special education teacher, and then I was a teacher consultant and behavior specialist. During that time, I worked in districts, and the a special ed director would ask me to go in and do an observation on a student and try to help out the teacher. And what I found is sometimes that was really helpful, that the really wanted support, and we worked together to support the student to do better. Sometimes it was viewed as a hurdle, like the director would say, okay, let's get Steve in here. He would do an observation, he'll write up a plan, and then the next step is we can refer that student for special education and move the student out of the classroom or out of the school. So there was no intent of truly implementing. It was more of or I wouldn't say no attempt, but there was lesser emphasis on changing as there was of how do we move the student into a different area. So that seems like it was just considered a series of process steps to get more support. And I think that's what's similar here, is that students move sequentially, that we have to, before we provide most intensive support, we have to go through making sure that they're benefiting from tier 1, and then we try tier 2. And the trouble is, we can, the biggest predictor of challenging behavior in the future is looking at the past behavior. So for students who are really struggling, we can find out, we can see their need, and we should address that with a sense of urgency and priority, as opposed to, well, let's see if it'll go away, or let's go throughout the series. And in the reality, this is from my colleague, Heather George in Florida. She brings up this analogy, if you're familiar with the old lava lamps, that it changes, right? Students go up and down the continuum. And so it may be that a student may start out and doing well, and then something will happen, and they are need intensive support right away. So if you look, other groups happen all the time. So this is what Stephanie put in. If you look at an analogy for a medical profession, you can see a triage approach. So the table on the left here, what that is doing is just saying, are they, if you look here, what is the urgency of it? And then what is the time that they should have for waiting with an approach? So to give you an example, let's think about the ideas of tiers and analogy with medical profession. So I have been running for a while. My daughter got me running, and I was, my physician is saying, that's good. You are at risk for high blood pressure, so go ahead and run and eat better as well. So that would be a tier 1 approach, right? I'm trying to do preventative. So what happened is, I was in a race, and this is about 4 years ago, and it was a 25K, about 15, 16 miles. And mile 11, I don't remember anything after that. And mile 12, I fell, and I collapsed, and I had traumatic, I broke my nose, I cut up my face. I had traumatic brain injury from that, and so I was rushed to the hospital. And in there, I had short-term memory loss. I couldn't remember anything. So during that time, immediately they didn't say, well, we need to go through a tier 2 approach to see if you're better. The emergency, they put me right in. I had a team, I had CAT scans, I had, all that work looking at me, and I had neurologists, asking me questions like, president of, I'm going to give you 5 words, and see if you can remember any of that. And certainly I couldn't remember any of those things. The whole approach here that I'm getting at with that scenario is, immediately I needed to go in for a intensive support. And then from that, then I may go back down, right? And over time, my short-term memory came back, and feeling better. But the idea is, the profession wasn't waiting to go through a series of steps for me. They needed to me right away. And I think the analogy fits as well for our students. But the difficulty is sometimes our students, it's not as obvious their intensive needs. So it's really important to look at. You don't have to go through tier 1, tier 2 to get to tier 3. We need to look at the issues right away. So what I'm looking here, Autumn, you're saying, do we have any examples of how districts create objective system for determining level of urgency for each student? If that would be great. If anyone has ideas, please feel free as you see the questions too to put that in. So what we have been trying to do for some, like the level of urgency, certainly if we need input from multiple sources, right? That will help us increase more confidence of where the urgencies are. So some things we look at is if there's a referral from the student, student may be self-referring to say, you know, I'm feeling really bad now. I'm feeling really depressed. I feel like everything is hopeless. That is some indicators, right, that we need to intervene quickly, and I want to make sure that I've got further assessment from those with more skills to help me guide that work. So I think my quick answer would be look at multiple sources of referring, have people on the team make a judgment to say how concerned are we moving forward with this, certainly from all those perspectives. I'm looking at some others. Is there documentation going direct 3? In our district, they are specifically told that a student cannot be placed in tier 3 unless 6 consecutive progress monitoring are below 25th percentile. So what I'm hearing you say, CJ, is that you're looking at decision rules for academic, I'm assuming, but maybe not. But so with that 6 progressive, so the question that I'm wondering, like, is how long are those progressive monitoring scores? Is it weekly? Is it, monthly? Certainly that would have a sense of urgency, right? So I'm sorry, I'm just trying to read the chats here as we are going on. Okay, you spoke about the myth of moving sequentially through the tiers, causing a lesser attempt at addressing the problem at tier 2. So how do you decide when to jump into tier 3 assessment results? Should there be specific cutoff? So it's a couple things. So for the behavior side, we are looking at the risk of harm to self or others. That would certainly have a more intensive urgency about it. We are also looking at the disruptiveness of the environment for the students engaging in behavior. So what I'm suggesting is I think it's all contextually identified. So if on a team, if you can say, yes, this is our criteria for moving forward, and then always question to say, is that reasonable? Is a student at risk, or are they getting the supports they need following through that? So my suggestion would be work with the school and the district to talk about criteria for moving forward. And if it's reasonable, like the CJ was talking about for the progress monitoring scores, is one process for that. Just seeing if I'm trying to answer some of these. So it's, the whole idea was, instead of a student waiting to fail, that we are trying to intervene earlier, because the earlier I intervene, the less intensity it may require, because if a student has been practicing errors for years and years, it's going to be much harder to change that than if they are just beginning to practice the errors. So intervening early is more important. Another thing to consider is it's hard because we want to make sure we're addressing the needs of students, but we also want to make sure that we have the system in place to support. And so it's like doing two things at once. It's supporting the students and developing your system to be efficient to address those needs. So Amy, just getting back to your question, you said, how do you decide to jump into tier 3? Is there a specific cutoff? So the cutoff would be if in the past, folks have used things like for behavior, 5 or more disciplinary referrals, major disciplinary referrals would indicate that a student should be receiving intensive support. But the trouble with that is that if you have to kind of put it in context, right? Because what if one of those incidents where a student brought a knife and was, attacking another, that it's different with the magnitude and the certainly the event of the referral. So we want to make sure that we are looking at the needs of the student and the context and severity for that. One thing to consider here, if we look at providing supports for all level, if this was, certainly remember the triangle, right? The green represents the supports provided for all students, the yellow for targeted for small groups, and the red for more intensive supports. If this is the percentage of students within schools who are receiving those supports, this just breaks down in there. If we look here, there's too few in this example performing at the desired level, and not enough resources can address all up above. So meaning if we are working on this in our school, we don't have, there are too many who need more intensive supports, and we just don't have the resources. So what, of course, the logic, and you should be well aware of this, right, with the whole theory here, is that as we improve, implement universal prevention, it pushes, the levels differently. So we have more students who are benefiting from tier 1 supports, and then we have less problems. So we can implement, and what it would do is certainly push the lower numbers for the more intensity. And we have actually seen that through our work over 800 schools here in Michigan. So when we look at it, so a couple things to consider. Some people say, well, if when we're looking at the idea here, is there, do we have to strengthen tier 1 supports before we start working on improving tier 2 supports? And again, the first question we had is kind of talking about students, and now I'm talking systems. Do we really enhance our core, and then before we look at our all 2-tier systems and supports that we're providing? And what we're finding is it doesn't have to be that way. It used to be like, yeah, only work on your tier 1, and then once you have that down and you're implementing that with fidelity, now move to tier 2. What we're finding though is you can move forward with tier 2 support as a system of developing that within your school or your district without having tier 1 perfectly in place. And the rationale for that is students will still need support, so you should be moving forward with that. Another rationale is looking at your tier 1 and you're focusing on improving that, and you're implementing tier 2 supports, and you're reviewing your whole system for tier 2, you may look back and say, yes, this is where we need to enhance our tier 1 better. So it may get more buy-in for folks to see that that's not quite there yet. And it also may give you ideas of what areas you should focus on for tier 1, because you'll see that pop up in what students need for tier 2. So misconception 3, tier support can occur independently of other tiers. So what this means is, do we just have tier 1, our universal, and that's not connected at all with tier 2, which is not connected at all with tier 3? You just have different programs in each, and they're not really aligned with each other. The idea that we are promoting is that they should all be interconnected. They are looking at ways to enhance. So enhance the overall educational experience. So let me give you 2 examples of this. So again, remember, anything that has the orange up here on the corner, these are addition. And if you won't see this, but I'm happy to email. So there's 2 categories of tier 2 supports. One is additive to tier 1. And what we mean by that is, you've got the tier 1, and then you go through that and you find students who need extra support, so you're going to layer on tier 2. And a second approach would be enhancements for accessing tier 1 using tier 2. So let me give you some examples. So here's the additive approach. We go through and we have tier 1, and so I'll use a behavior example here. We teach behavior expectations to each student, all the students. We give examples, non-examples of what it means to be safe, responsible, respectful within the school, within the classroom, within the hallway, within the media center. We teach what those expectations are. And we find out that there are a few students who may not have understood what it was. They may need more practice. They may need just further training or further exposure and more practice with social skills that are beyond just being respectful or responsible. They may need some very specific social skills of how to get along. So if you look here, with the additive approach, that would be examples. You would add in check in, check out, so you can give more. For that, you can provide more social skills, and these are things that would be tier 1 is there, but it's not enough. So we want to provide more support so that as their social skills are in place, they can go back and better experience tier 1 through that. A different way to do that, and so both are good. It's just the different types of programs that you would use. So examples here is the check-in, check-out, and social skills. With the enhancing for tier 1, so remember, I used the example of we're teaching all students what is be respectful, responsible within the school, within the classroom, within different settings. But I may know, because I'm on the leadership team, or I've been working with students over the years, that I know that there's going to be some students who will not be successful with just that overall teaching of being respectful, being responsible. So for this, I would take those students and I would teach those before I teach everybody else. I would take those students and say, okay, we're going to go in the hallway, and we're going to talk about being respectful and responsible in the hallway. And, this walk, this is what it means, the tone of your voice, this is what it means with, when you're greeting people. And I give examples, not examples. And those students have extra practice before the rest of the group. And the benefit of that is, by the time the whole group gets together, I'm teaching everyone. Those students that I had some pre-teaching beforehand, they are much better to experience that whole intervention, that whole tier 1 support. They understand what I'm talking about. They've had practice, and I can even use those as examples to say, John, I know you know this. Show us an example of being, responsible in the hallway. So this is just for this enhancement type of thing is pre-teaching behavior expectations prior to tier 1. So in the session I did yesterday, talking about just the introduction, this same approach can be used for academic. And here's what it looked like. I mentioned yesterday that I used to be a teacher consultant for students on the autism spectrum disorder. And I'm working with some students who it's hard to understand abstract terms. So the example I used yesterday, I was working with this one student, and it was during a science lesson, and they were teaching transparency and opaqueness. And that was really hard for the student because it wasn't very concrete, and just reading about it wasn't enough. So that lesson for transparency and opaqueness was on Thursday. And what I did was worked with the student on Wednesday and said, let's talk about opaqueness. This is going to be a lesson coming up. Just wanted to give you a heads up of what it is, and let's practice. I gave examples of opaqueness, transparency. I showed differences between the two, had the student practice, identifying. And by the time the lesson came on Thursday, that student really had it down and could benefit from that lesson, where in the past, because it was not very clear for the student, student could be looking out the window, could be drawing pictures, just wasn't benefiting. So the idea of the enhancement here is that if we do some pre-teaching, they can better access the overall universal supports. So it's just a way to think about it different of how they're all connected. And I'm just looking, and please feel free to keep adding things to the chat, and certainly thank you for adding your emails in there. I will copy that and send out this information to you when we're done. So there's a connection right across, and what we're saying is it's connected across with content. It's connected across the tiers with the levels of support, with the whole idea of how do we better enhance the overall education programming. So this is a slide from Stephanie, and I'm sure it's a really good example, but I don't know what it is, so I'm gonna skip it, but maybe get a chance to hear from her what it is. So if you look here, when we think about the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 approach, I like the term that some have used is we're engineering effective environments. And engineering effective environments is not only the supports we provide for the student so that they can benefit more from the universal for the intervention, but it's also setting it up so that the student has the skills to act upon those environmental supports. So we got the environment and the student interaction, right? So when you look here, these are examples of how do we engineer the environment so that a student can better benefit from the education programming, but it's also connected with, and you'll see things here like more practice, or just looking at a way to provide feedback. It's helping the student with the skills so that they can better benefit from that engineered environment. So I'm going to move here to the next. So this is just some reflection questions. So if you can take, and certainly I didn't talk about Pirate Club, so I don't know what that is, so sorry about that. But if you could think about isolated tiers that you have in school, or how tier 2, tier 3? I'd be curious in your, do you see a flow or a connecting or alignment in your district or school across the tiers, or do they tend to be isolated? That students who do tier 2 are brought down to this room, they do it and they come back and I don't know what they did, would be an example of more isolation. So what are your thoughts about the connect, or questions that you might have further about connectedness? Please feel free to put any of that in the chat. Okay. So it looks like a lot more isolation and building dependent. So I appreciate, Jason, you're saying we have to look at the context here. But it looks like most are saying that it's isolation. And to me, it makes sense that it's isolation because let's be real about this, right? It takes a lot of work to intensify supports. And it's easier to do things if I have a package program that I say, yes, I'm going to learn and I'm going to apply this for intervention for tier 2. It takes more work trying to make it connected. It takes more work for training for staff. It takes more work for supporting how that connection should take place, looking across the curriculum. It takes more work for time for that planning. So I do, it's understandable to me, that it would be more isolated. So I'm just going through more of the comments here. Yes, so Jamie, you said it helps when tier 1 handles the tiers, when the team handles the tiers, so you can really see connections across, absolutely. Autumn, you're saying you have certain staff assigned to each tier, and we have everyone be interventionists across the tiers. It may change perception. So I think that the theme that I'm hearing you say across some of the comments here, communication is important. So who's in charge of supporting those implementers or supporting students? Make sure we are talking to each other and making sure we are looking at the data to see where our needs are to connect. Beth, you're saying, is tier 3 always provided via special education services? If not, can you give example? Absolutely. So let me see here. That is actually part of, I'm going to jump ahead to that because you brought it up. At Misconception 5, special education and MTSS are completely separate systems. So here's the issue, talking about special ed with that. What we do know is that the vast majority of students receiving special education services spend the majority of their time within the general ed setting. So if you look at the data from the U.S. Department of Ed, you'll see that the majority of students receiving special ed are spending majority of the time in general ed classrooms. So within that, then the idea is special ed is not a location. It is the services provided, right? And within the services provided, it doesn't really, the key issue is not the setting, right? It's what we do. So what we try to say is supports are, well, let me go to this slide here a minute. So let's think about just an example within the classroom. We've got all students in there. We've got some students who are experiencing difficulties, either academic or behavior, and we've got some students who are receiving special education services. And if you look at this diagram, within that classroom, the students are receiving special education. Some may not be experiencing problems with their behavior, right? They just may be having difficulty with, decoding skills, or maybe they're having difficulty with mobility. So it's different here for the supports for this example, for behavior. And there are students who need more intensive behavior supports who are not receiving special education services. So it's not mutually exclusive across this. So what we do then is go back and say, well, across each student is receiving special education, then what are they should be exposed to the general, because they're spending most of the time, they should be exposed to general curriculum, right? So for behavior, it'd be all students are taught your expectations, what are, be responsible, be safe, whatever you have. And then it may be that some students with special need that check-in, check-out system. So they are exposed to the tier 1, but they are also added on with a check-in, check-out. And through all that, it may be that a student may be struggling with behavior that they, on their IEP, they have very specific intervention plans for behavior based on a functional behavior assessment, based on social skills training that's connected with it. So that's an idea where a student doing special education service is cut across all the tiers. Yeah, so looking at, you have trained interventions that provide tier 3. It's not just for IEPs. So I think that fits right in. And then that you're saying the academic and behavior interventions support staff and students at tier 2 strategies and work in small groups of students, and your at-risk social workers, academic intervention, internal external partnerships assist as determined. So what I appreciate about tier 3, what I appreciate about what you're saying there is it's not only the intensity of support, it is the increasing the capacity of the staff. So you're bringing in more expertise, the more severe the interventions need to be. So I appreciate that. That's what we're talking about, right? Increasing support not only for the student, but making sure we've got the right things that we're doing. And we increase our confidence with the expertise added in. So I hope, Beth, that gives you an example of cutting across. And again, any of this I'd be happy to follow up with emails if you have questions, or give me a phone call or whatever. Here's another misconception. So I'm bouncing back. If you're following on the slides, I went back to misconception 4. Students receiving tier 3 intensive supports need interventions in all areas because they're tier 3 students. So I'm jumping ahead here. So this is, George Sagai often talks about this, is that one, we don't want to label students as being that tier 3 kid, or that kid who is in the red, or what we want to do is label the supports provided, because one, it's more focusing on the needs of the student as opposed to just labeling as like a trait. This is what they are, a characteristic. The second thing is the reality is students have many different assets, and they have different needs, just like me, just like you. So what George brings in this example of Theora is, if you think about it, Theora may be doing really well in social studies, and she may be doing really well in basketball and social studies and writing and reading and Spanish, technology. She may be struggling somewhat in science, and she may be really having difficulty in math. So when you look here and just say, well, Theora's a tier 3 kid, well, that's not really accurate, right? Because if you're saying of deficits, she's got some really strong areas. If you're saying she's a tier 3 kid, for math, Well, she's got some needs to support, but let's focus on what's going well, the assets, and let's focus on what we can do to help with support. So it doesn't make sense to call her a tier 3 kid. It makes more sense to look at profile of strengths, assets of needs, and then develop support plans based on that. So again, this is just a summary of what we were just saying. Tier 3 supports are based on the intensity, not the type of need. Tier 3 supports, and it kind of ties into the special education issue question. It's not a location. We've got that tier 3 room down the hall. Let's send Johnny down there and have him fixed by that. It doesn't make sense to talk like that. What we need to do is look at the type of need, the intensity of need, and what supports are provided. And again, I want to emphasize with the rusty pipe example, it's not just allocating time, it's the precision of what you do with that time that is so important. So considerations of that. I think the other thing that, and again, this is what Stephanie and Maureen Ziegler were talking about here when she created this slide, is that this distinction is important because when we start labeling kids, particularly if we're labeling students based on deficits, what we don't want is the explanation that their problems are theirs, and they were born that way, or that's the way that they are developing. And the problem with that is one it minimizes what they can do and what they can't do, but it also takes some of the onus of support off of me, and I'm here to help, as I mentioned earlier, engineer environments so that student can interact more effectively with that. So we need to look at both those issues of providing support, ensuring the student is successful without diminishing, through labeling the students. So I certainly didn't do that justice for what Stephanie would say, but I just want to try my best there. So we talked about the misconception about special education, and I gave you that example here. I want to talk about another misconception, that students should receive academic and behavior support separately. Like if you're tier 3, I'm only going to provide you a tier 3 support. If you need tier 3 supports for behavior, I'm only going to look at behavior. And same thing for academic. So what we've noticed in the so over the course of 21 years, we've been implementing this work in 800 schools. A pattern, just as you said, it tends to be isolated when you look at your tiered supports. It tends to be isolated with the content area as well. And so if a student goes in with a academic problem, a refer for academic problem, they tend to come out from that team meeting and that support process, come out with an academic intervention plan. If they go in with a behavior concern and go through the team process and they come out with a behavior plan. And I think it's a true missed opportunity to see the interconnection of both. So what we typically have been pushing is, through your process, look at what the is, and then as you're doing assessments, ask questions around other content areas. So for example, if a student is referred for academic problems, and then you're doing your academic diagnostic assessment, also ask questions in the team to say, is there any concern that the behavior may be interfering with instruction? Maybe the student is engaging behavior that has them removed from instruction, or maybe There are other things contributing to it, like attendance. So just ask further questions. And same thing for the behavior. If a student is referred for a behavior issue, within that team, we ask you to broaden your questioning to say, well, is there certain things when you're doing a functional behavior assessment, are there things that kind of look like the student is escaping or avoiding academic tasks? Is the behavior associated with that? If that's the case, then you need to have an intervention that's connected to both. So just to emphasize that, if you think about the possibilities of behavior and academic concerns around functional behavior. So got one student who is engaged in problem behaviors. It could be that, in the hallway, he was pushing other students or he's harassing others. So there's a concern around behavior errors that we want to develop his skills around that. We've got another student who could be having difficulty with math. Maybe doesn't have the conceptualization of math facts or numeracy and needs more work in the academic problem, but doesn't have any behavior problem. We also could have a student who has this interrelated behavior and academic problem. And what I mean by that is this student, it could be when you do functional assessment, you start looking at that whenever academic demands are placed on the student that are at grade level, when you're asking the student to read out loud or to do this work problems based on the reading, and he doesn't read very well, it may be that he engages in behavior to escape, and he doesn't, he starts swearing, he starts, getting upset, being disruptive around, doesn't want to do that task. And then another opportunity, you may have another student who has not related problems. So the student may have some behavior difficulties on the playground. Got her favorite swing. She'll push kids out of it because she wants that. But she also may struggle with, some academic tasks, some writing skills. And it may appear that those aren't related at all. So the kids that are part of our targeting on the playground for behavior have nothing to do with the academic problem. So our interventions that we're saying is, there are real world connections across this. So let's look at this example here. So this is from Kent McIntosh, who has done some studies of looking at this connection of academic and behavior. So the teacher presents student with grade level tasks. So remember Eric here, who's in the middle. So Eric is presented with a task. The student engages in a problem behavior, starts, being disruptive, raising his voice, starts using inappropriate language, and the teacher removes the task or removes the student. So the teacher at this point may say, Eric, it looks like you're not ready to work right now. You either go sit outside the classroom, or you go to the office, so the teachers are removing the academic task. So if you think about right there, the student is struggling with the academic task, engages in behavior that allows him to be removed or the task removed, escapes that academic task. Think about what's happening then. All the other students who are still there are experiencing instruction. They're getting further ahead, right? The teacher's moving on the literacy instruction and is able to work on vocabulary and some other things, and comprehension skills. Because Eric is not in there, his academic skills don't improve. As everyone is moving forward, he is not moving forward. And then the teacher, the cycle continues, presents the task, and Eric may engage in the problem behavior to escape. So it's almost like you start wondering, is it the behavior that sets the stage for academic problems because of the cycle? Or is it the difficulty in academic problems, and Eric may not want to look dumb in front of his peers, so he engages in behavior to escape so he doesn't have to look like that? We don't know. It's probably a combination. It could be that difficulty in some academic could lead to behavior problems, and difficulty in behavior may lead to academic because of the cycle. So it's the issue I'm getting at is academic and behavior support should really be looking in connection. One other thing, and I shared this yesterday, we were working in a model demonstration. We had a grant-funded research project early on. And we're working with 4 elementary schools. And for that, this represents all the elementary students in those 4 schools. So there's 4,074. What you see in the triangle, the green represents benchmark supports, meaning that students were basically on the right trajectory for success in reading. The yellow represents students who need more strategic supports, and the red, the students who would need 24% needed more intensive support. The next thing we did is we broke it out to say of students who had 6 or more office discipline referrals, major discipline referrals. So if they had 6 or more, we would separate them out and then looked at their reading score, based on this dynamic indicators of basic early assessment, which is a curriculum-based assessment for reading. And then for those students who had 6 or more discipline referrals, what we found is that 56% of those students needed more intensive literacy instruction. So I think that is adds more credibility or more confidence on our end that we see this cycle going on. Students who engage in difficult behavior that allows them to escape or be removed also have some correlation here with a greater need for supports. So that's just an example through there. And I'm looking here at our time, so we've got just a few minutes. Just wondering, in the chat, is there questions you have as we're winding down around the myths, or are there myths that you've heard that aren't on here that you want to talk further about? And again, as you're thinking, I do see the email addresses, so I'll copy that and send out these slides for you if you're interested. And then you also please feel free to write to me or give me a call if you have other questions. So CJ, you're saying myth that many of our teachers through Tier 3 with special education. Yes, many teachers thought Tier 3 was special education. Yeah, and I think that's reasonable when we hear of the early on response to intervention that was in IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, where they talk about eligibility determination through a response to intervention. So that kind of would make people think, well, we can use that for identifying students with special education needs. So we, so I think that myth kind of makes sense. We did talk about, right, that it's not true that it's across all tiers. And we also know that there are students who need Tier 3 supports who may not be eligible for special education. for the behavior, you can see that there are students who need much more behavior support without special education, but academic as well. I worked with a student who family travels a lot, and it wasn't that he was eligible for special education. It was that he didn't have enough exposure to effective instruction. So he needed very intensive supports, but he wasn't eligible for special. It wasn't a disability that was causing that. It was a lack of exposure to good instruction. Any other thoughts through all this? Okay. Well, again, I so appreciate your time. I know we've got 1 minute here, and I'm going to put up the final code. And any thoughts around that, Michelle, that should let people know?
No, we just would like you to record the sketch code that's on the screen now. Make sure that you record it in the correct row for your breakout session, which this is Mythbusters, Dispelling Common Misconceptions of Tier 2 and 3. And thank you, Steve, for presenting such an engaging session. Time just flew by. And thank you all for attending. And I think your next session is starting at 10:25. So enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. I wish you the very best, and good luck with the start of the school year.